Welcome to the Program Evaluation for Educational Leads workshop, a program for faculty development and McPherson Institute collaboration. So McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. That wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent a territory and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. Today is June 7th, 2021. We are slowly inching towards the end of a global pandemic, which irreversibly changed the landscape of our educational systems. We're also a few days since the news broke about the tragedy discovered at the Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia. As clinicians and educators working in health professional education, we will need to keep improving the system for our Indigenous patients, learners, and colleagues. As one facet of this important work, today we're focusing on the why and how of evaluating health professional education programs. And this is an important topic, especially for those of us who are in program leadership roles. So I'm pleased to introduce to you the panelists for this workshop today. Crystal Fang is an assistant clinical professor and diagnostic neuroradiologist at the Hamilton Health Sciences. She is the assistant program director, competency committee chair, and CBD lead for neuroradiology residency program. Amy Goulash is a lead educational developer, curriculum development at McMaster's McPherson Institute. Amy supports faculty and staff members at McMaster who are undergoing cyclical program reviews or developing new program proposals. Chris Nash is an educational developer with McMaster's McPherson Institute. Rebecca Taylor is educational developer with McPherson Institute. In her role, Rebecca supports the delivery of various teaching and learning resources for faculty, instructors, staff, and graduate students, and leads the McPherson Institute's feedback services portfolio and Faculty of Health Sciences liaison team. I'm Catherine Tong. I'm an assistant clinical professor and emergency physician affiliated with the Department of Family Medicine. I lead the faculty development program at the Waterloo Regional Campus of McMaster University, Michael G. DeGroote School of Medicine. So today we're going to walk you through an introduction to the important concepts of program evaluation. We will review the definitions, theories, and models using examples in health professional education. We will also have a chance to work with you on applying these models to help you evaluate your program in an interactive component of this workshop later on. I will have Chris to start us off on some definitions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Nash. I'm an educational developer, online learning with the McPherson Institute here at McMaster. Primarily, I focus on supporting educators to elevate the pedagogical use of educational technologies to enhance teaching and learning. And to get started here with our slides, we're going to go over a few definitions. To get started, quality assurance. So quality assurance, QA, encompasses the processes and procedures that ensure established standards and practices are being met. This is done through audits and other forms of assessment to detect and correct problems or variances that fall outside of these established standards or requirements. Quality improvement, QI, is a systematic, formal approach to the analysis of practice performance and efforts to improve existing processes or systems. This simple framework provided can guide specific improvement activities in personal work, teams, or working groups. Having a look at the diagram just here on the right, we can see a few questions to start out with. What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that a change is an improvement? What change can we make that will result in an improvement? And then following the flow, you see act, plan, do, and study. Program evaluation is a systematic method for collecting, analyzing, and using information to answer questions about projects, policies, and programs, particularly about their effectiveness and efficiency. The example on the right is a sample framework for program evaluation in public health created by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Following this flow, you can see the various steps, engaging stakeholders, describing the program, focusing on evaluation design, gathering credible evidence, justify conclusions, and use and share lessons learned. I will now pass things over to my colleague, Amy.
Thank you, Chris. So just to further add to the definitions, for those of you that are familiar with the McMaster context, and for those of you that are not, I just wanted to provide a little bit more clarity around what we mean, what we call the institutional quality assurance process, which is a process that is done at every degree granting institution in Ontario. So it's guided by the Quality Assurance Framework, which is a provincial framework, and McMaster has a policy that aligns to that framework. This would certainly fit in that definition that Chris just provided of quality assurance, but you'll note that the primary objective in McMaster's quality assurance process, and in general the process across Ontario, is to emphasize the commitment to the continuous improvement of programs, which sort of starts to blur with other definitions that were just provided. And also central to the philosophy behind the quality assurance process here at McMaster is the quality of student experience within their academic programs. So the policy that I mentioned, it governs both all three of these components. Cyclical program reviews, which occur every 7 years for every undergrad and graduate program at McMaster. That review involves a preparation of a self-study as well as a 2-day site visit. The policy also covers the any new program development for degree granting programs as well as graduate diplomas. And lastly, any major curriculum modifications. As we were preparing for this presentation, it became very apparent to us that there was some confusion amongst the group, or some terms that would be helpful to clarify as it relates to accreditation. So I just drew up this relatively simplistic slide to further explain the differences at McMaster between what the quality assurance processes are and generally what accreditation processes involve. So here, the policy drives the review of the quality assurance, and it's done within McMaster itself. It's largely it really emphasizes the autonomy both of the university as a whole as well as the program's autonomy. In contrast, you'll see, or perhaps you're familiar with, accreditation processes, which are driven by accreditation boards that are outside of the university itself. So there are some examples of accreditation boards there. There are similarities in the sense that both of these reviews occur regularly on a regular schedule. There's lots of advance notice typically. I don't think I've ever heard of a surprise accreditation review happening. People, if anything, know they're coming for many, many months, if not years ahead of time. Both of them, by and large, review and programs, though accreditation can also refer to individual accreditation and school accreditation. But typically how we see them used at McMaster in this context is for program review. Oh, it can also be for individual courses, I should say, as well. The focus on, like I mentioned, the quality assurance process at McMaster is on the student experience and areas for improvement. So it's a chance to air gaps, things that might need to be some stoking of the curriculum, I sometimes describe it. With accreditation, generally the emphasis is on demonstrating the achievement of professional standards. So really a discouragement from the sort of identifying areas for improvement. That really is dependent on the accreditation board and the philosophy behind each individual accreditation board. A key difference here, the main key difference I'll leave you with, is the potential outcomes of a quality assurance review at McMaster. By and large, a review that's conducted that might trigger concern, the outcome of that would be further review processes within the university. So it might call on what's known as a departmental review, which is different than this academic curriculum review, or it might trigger an earlier review in the standard earlier than the standard process. So the standard process is every 7 years. So if there's a concern, a program might be asked to complete a full cyclical program review within 5 years, for example. In contrast, the potential outcome for accreditation review is that the program may lose the accreditation standing. So those are the primary differences. And I will now pass the slide deck and the controls over to Crystal to talk us through some program evaluation more specifically.
Thank you to Chris and Amy for that wonderful introduction. Just to go back to the definitions and to reiterate what Chris has already said, program evaluation, what it really means is it's a systematic collection and analysis of information to answer questions about the effectiveness and the efficiency of the program. So in this diagram, what it means to say is that it's really looking at your educational program and what the goals and the objectives are for that educational program. And then it's a bit cyclical. It goes back to look at how the education program is meeting those goals and objectives. So there's no real start to beginning to program evaluation. You have what your anticipated outcomes are, and then you look at what you can do to meet those anticipated outcomes again. And so fundamentally, it is really about change. And what I mean is that you implement change into your education program so that you can meet that target goal or objective. It's almost like calibrating your system to ensure the appropriate outcome. So that's really program evaluation, the nature of the change and whether that change is successful by this definition. So why is program evaluation important? Before we start on how to do it, why should we be doing this? So there are both external and internal reasons to support the development of program evaluation. Often the external reasons can be the driving force that really starts program evaluation. And I mean this to reference what Amy has said. Often accreditation bodies are really going to be what's driving program evaluation. More and more frequently now, there's been a shift from a process-oriented system in healthcare education to more of an outcomes-oriented system. So educators and accreditation bodies are now looking at more so the results of an educational program rather than just how something is being taught. To be more granular, I can give the example of academic half-day teaching sessions or curricula. Before, accreditors would look at more what topics were being delivered, the content, the accuracy of the content, if it was up to date. But in an outcomes-oriented approach to educational design, what you're really looking at is not just what content is being delivered, but whether there is actual learning transference that's taking place with the learners. So instead of just looking at the curriculum itself, accreditation bodies are looking to ensure that the program also has this component that, for example, assesses attendance. Are the learners going to these sessions? Or is there an evaluation at the end of session to see whether the learners enjoyed the session? These are all processes that can result in improved outcomes. And these are all program evaluation processes. So that's an external reason for why we have to have a program evaluation process in place. And of course, this directly relates to some of the internal reasons that supports accountability. So educators not only have to deliver the content, but they have to ensure that the content being delivered is actually used or gained by the learners. And it also allows educators to gain useful knowledge about the program. So a program evaluation process really takes a magnifying glass to the educational program, and you're going through it looking for any gaps or deficiencies in the education program that you can then change. So again, fundamentally, it is about change. Another big external reason for why program evaluation is important is, of course, funding. There are a lot of educational bodies now that will provide grants to support innovative educational initiatives. So this is an incentive to develop program evaluation. When you have program evaluation, again, you're constantly or continuously going back to look at your education program design. And with that, you're bound to come up with new educational ideas and educational developments. So there's that internal motivation for sustainability of ongoing program development by acquiring the funds to achieve that. And of course, when you go back and look at your program, you will inevitably engage your learners in the development of your education program. And when learners are engaged in what they're trying to learn or engaged in developing the curriculum, then this will result in increased efficacy of the programs. And in healthcare, the ultimate goal is to improve healthcare outcomes. So program evaluation is quite important. Okay, to dive a little bit deeper into program evaluation, I want to review some of the basic theories that have existed in terms of what's been used to develop models for program evaluation. We won't go into anything in too much detail because this really isn't about philosophy, but some of the theories are very interesting and hopefully will give you a basic understanding of how the program evaluation models exist. Okay, so to start off with, this is sort of a more simple theory, reductionism. It's a theory that has been used in both philosophy and in the sciences. And its basis is that that a system is nothing more than a sum of its component parts. So, for example, if the system is an educational program, this theory reduces the educational program into its key components. So a residency program is really going to be made up of its specific educational components, such as academic half days, plus clinic hours, plus experience with procedures, and of course, in training examinations. If you add all these component parts up, it equals an educational program, your residency program. Of course, we know that it's not always as simple as that. Reductionism really assumes that there is no relationship between these parts. So spending more time in academic half day will have no effect on what you learn during your clinic hours. That's reductionism. It assumes linearity. So that means that if there's a small change in any one of these component parts, there's a direct small impact on the educational program. And likewise, if there is a large change, then you would have a large impact on the educational program. This is what's called the cause and effect paradigm. So we have this assumption of linearity and causality in reductionism. This is a really nice example of what reductionism sort of looks like. So this is a beautiful photograph from Indy Sagu, and it shows the picture of a face. And if I were a true, pure reductionist, I would say a face is simply a sum of its component parts. It's made out of eyes, two eyes, to be specific, two eyebrows, a nose, a mouth, two ears. And if you put those parts together, you're going to get a face. It doesn't really matter how you put it together. Of course, we do know that that is not true. This lovely piece from Pablo Picasso has all the requisite component parts. You know, it has two eyes, the eyebrows, nose, a mouth, two ears. You put it all together, this is a face, right? But of course, it doesn't take into account the viewer's perception of what is beauty. You know, does that play a role into the definition of a face? So the reductionist theory, even though it has nice basic principles, does have some limitations. If we translate that to an educational program, we have to say that the parts do make up an educational program, but there are some interplays between its component parts. Enter Aristotle. So he nicely summed this up with the quote, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, meaning that you can't just put together all the component parts of an educational program and call it an educational program. You know, there is more to it. And when you put them all together, it should be even greater than everything together. So this is the basis behind the general systems theory. The general systems theory, developed in the 1920s, really says that you cannot measure the success of a program based on the parts. The components, the system's components all have interactions and interrelations that exist within and interact with the environment. So in our case, the system is an educational program, and these component parts, they interact with each other. So when you make a change to one component part, there will be an effect on the other component parts. And then the additive effect of all the different effects within the component parts will result in a much greater change in your educational program or your outcome than anticipated. The general systems theory does talk about two different types of systems. There's the closed system or an open system. A closed system really means that all the individual parts of a system, again, in our case, the educational program, interact with each other, but not with the environment. In an open system, the parts interact with each other as well as with the environment to change the outcome. Again, to put it into an example, if in an educational program, if it was a closed system, a change in one of the parts, say the lectures, would have an effect on the other part of the training, so the clinical training, and which would then have a greater effect on the outcome. But in an open system, not only would those two parts interact with each other, so a change in the training would change how much you learn from a clinical experience, but you would also have an interaction within the environment. So learners will be learning from each other or learning from teachers in different ways. So it's a lot more dynamic in a general systems theory. If we take that one step further and talk about complexity theory, complexity is a science that studies the non-linear dynamical interactions among multiple agents in open systems that are far from equilibrium. So that's a mouthful. But what it really means is that it's similar to systems theory in that it posits there are interactions between different component parts, but it goes beyond that to say that the system itself has a history. So it's not just that it interacts with the environment, but there are other parts that are brought into the system from over time, and that there's a difference in interactions between relationships and not just interactions between component parts, if that makes sense. It is a bit complex, pardon my pun, but hopefully I can show what I mean with this illustrative example. So in this illustration, you can see that this structure or artwork is comprised of many different things. If I were a reductionist, I would say that this piece of work is comprised of different colors and different shapes. And that's all it is, just different colors and shapes put together. You can rearrange it, put it in any different way you want, and it's still the same thing. So that's the reductionist view. So green tube plus red heart plus yellow circle plus yellow squares would equal whatever this object is supposed to be. However, the general systems theory would come in and say, well, no, these parts aren't just put together randomly. These parts all have meaning. So I'm going to assign meaning to the parts. And so these parts now have to be placed in a specific spot. So let's say this is not just a yellow circle. This is the sun. If this is the sun, then it should be high up in the sky, right? And then if I use that as a backdrop, then it's going to have effect on the other parts that I'm seeing. Now, suddenly this green tube may not just be a green tube. It may be a slide. Now I'm starting to see a playground. These are trees in the playground. Perhaps this is a stone pathway to the playground, and there's some more trees over here, some stools for children to sit on. It becomes a lot more than just the sum of its parts. Right now I'm starting to see a picture. Okay. So what can complexity theory add? Well, complexity theory is going to add the perspectives of the people here looking at this object. So perhaps this woman on this side is coming to this playground because it was her childhood playground. And then she's going to have a different lens looking at the playground, is going to interpret this structure completely differently from this a man and woman on the right-hand side who are looking at this. They've just moved to the neighborhood. They've got a lot of anxiety and fear. Perhaps all the colors are going to look a lot darker. So the addition of the backgrounds of these people, the cultures, their perspectives, is going to change how this system functions. So that's complexity theory. Okay. So hopefully everyone has a solid understanding of that. Feel free to jump in with any questions. I don't have everyone's screens on my screen. So just feel free to raise your hand or type something in the chat. And hopefully I can answer them. But I'm going to now go over some of the more common evaluation models that exist. And a lot of these models do come from the theories that I just talked about. There are three common ones that are used in healthcare education. There's the experimental or the quasi-experimental approach, Kirkpatrick's approach, and the logic model. Experimental and quasi-experimental approaches, I'm not going to go into in detail. They're they're somewhat straightforward, especially for those who have a science background. Similar to a science experiment, this type of evaluation model really looks at two different cohorts, a control group and the exposure group, where you're going to expose your educational change or teaching session. And then you're going to measure the outcomes of those two groups to see if your teaching session had an impact on their learning, whether it's knowledge, acquired skills, or you select the outcome. So that's an experimental approach. There are a lot of limitations with an experimental approach. It is very linear and it does assume causality again. And it doesn't really take into account any confounding factors. So any interplay between your new exposure and your background educational design. Kirkpatrick's approach, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail with, and then also the logic model. So you get a general understanding of exactly how program evaluation models can help. So some of you may have heard of Donald Kirkpatrick. He's often thought of as the leader of learning evaluation, and he's developed 4 levels of evaluation designed as a sequence of ways to evaluate training progress. So this is a really nice example of his 4 levels of program evaluation. So I should note that you do not need to take only certain levels of this model in order to build your program evaluation. You should actually be using the model as a whole, because each component part does aid in the building of a more comprehensive program evaluation for the entirety of your education program. Many people think that the level 1 and level 2 type of program evaluation is going to be your easiest kind of a program evaluation, and that it becomes more difficult to perform a level 3 or level 4 type of evaluation. And because of this, often people will stop at only doing level 1 and level 2 evaluation, but it's really at level 3 and level 4 where you're going to gain most of your useful data for your program evaluation. So it's really important to do those higher levels of program evaluation. So to go into a little bit more detail, a level 1 type of evaluation is really measuring the reaction of your learner to your educational design. So your teaching session. Did the learners enjoy the training? So it's the degree that the participants found the training engaging or relevant to the jobs. And an example of this would be asking learners what they thought of the training session after you implement it. So that's a level 1 type of evaluation. A level 2 type of program evaluation is really looking at whether the learning has occurred. Did learning transfer occur? It measures the degree to which the participants have acquired knowledge, skills, or has undergone a change in attitude because of your training session. So an example of this would be assessing knowledge and skills with a pre and post test after you implement your training session. So that's a level 2 type of evaluation, fairly straightforward. And when we move up the pyramid to a level 3 type of program evaluation, now you're starting to look at the impact on the learned behavior of your learner. So this training changed the behavior, and this is specific to the context in which the learner practices. So it should be in a practical setting. And I should note that often with level 2 and level 3 type of evaluation it is often helpful to have a control group, so a group that has not been exposed to the training. And this takes some components from that experimental type of modeling. And then finally, a level 4 type of program evaluation is looking at the final results or the long-term outcomes in a larger context. It's looking at whether training influenced performance. And when I say performance, I don't mean at an individual level. It's really the performance of the group. Has that changed because of your implemented change or training session? So it's measuring any targeted outcome that is defined. So it can be in the broader sense, like a patient outcome, healthcare cost savings, healthcare team performance, that sort of thing. That's the thing what you're measuring at the very top of the pyramid. And one important thing to note, and I think Rebecca will probably touch on this a little bit later, is that when you're building program evaluation, people will often start at the bottom because it is the easiest thing to build into your educational design. But scholars are now stressing that we should be starting at the top of the pyramid. We should be looking at what outcomes are we trying to evaluate first before evaluating, a learner's reaction to what's being taught. And that's because if you know what outcome you want to drive, that's going to help design your educational tool that you're going to implement. So it's naturally going to feed to the bottom of the pyramid and help you really use the evaluation tools at every level if you start at the top. So we'll go through a quick scenario that can help you better understand Kirkpatrick's model. So in this vignette, the internal review is coming up. So, and as the program director of a small neuroradiology residency program, you'll remember that I am part of a neuroradiology residency program. You have an interest in medical education, and you recently created a team-based learning session for new residents on how to interpret trauma head CTs as part of your academic half-day curriculum. Now you want to measure the outcomes of this new teaching method at all the different levels. So how are you going to use Kirkpatrick's model to design a program evaluation process? So I'll just go through this quickly. Let's look again at this pyramid, and let's start at the level 1 type of, at the level 1 component. I want to evaluate the reaction. Did the learners like this new TBL teaching session that I implemented for CT heads? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to design an evaluation form and implement a TBL session evaluation form. And I'm going to make sure that I include in this evaluation form questions about how engaging the lecturer was, or the leader, I should say, the teacher, and whether they thought the material was relevant. So that's going to be a part of my program evaluation, as I'm going to evaluate individual sessions. Now, going to a level 2 type of evaluation, now I need to know whether learning transfer occurred. It's great if the learners enjoyed the training, but how do I know that they actually gained knowledge or skills from this teaching session? One way I could do that is to test them. So I'm going to implement an OSCE and then look at those OSCE results. So an OSCE, for those who are not familiar with the term, is objective structured clinical examination. So it's an exam of sorts to look at learning transfer. And again, I should compare this with a group, perhaps a cohort who hasn't undergone this session, to see if the results changed. Now I want to do a level 3 type of evaluation. So now this is getting a little bit harder. I need to see if the if the training session changed the behavior of my trainees in the specific clinical context that I want the change to be in. So how can I evaluate that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to design some sort of assessment form for my clinical teachers and ask them to observe my learners in the wild, in the practice setting. And then I'm going to get the results from these assessment forms to see if there's been an improvement in the interpretation of trauma head CTs. This can be subjective, but it would be very nice if I implemented this assessment form for 2 groups, one who has, again, undergone the training and one who has not undergone the training, and then see if the qualitative feedback that I get from the assessors is overall improved for those who underwent the training session. Okay, now most importantly, I need to evaluate whether this training session has an improvement on specific large-scale outcomes. So what can I do? I'm going to look at the reporting times for trauma head CTs on call by my learners. So as a group, is the turnaround time for these CTs improved? Is it going faster? It doesn't have to be just turnaround times, but I'm selecting this because improved turnaround times may lead to improved discharge of patients from the ER, or admission of the patients. And this may improve funding for the ER or improve patient outcomes because patients are getting seen faster because of the workflow has been improved. So these are all level 4 type of evaluations. And you can see how it's important to start from the top. If I know that what I really want to get at is to improve the speed of interpretation of trauma CT heads, then I know what I'm going to focus on as my goals and objectives in my level 1 training session. So that's using Kirkpatrick's model to look at program evaluation at all different levels. Certainly there's some limitations to Kirkpatrick's 4-level evaluation model. I don't want to go into too much details about the limitations, but it doesn't take into account a lot of different components. Like we said, in systems theory and complexity theory, there's lots of interactions that may not be taken account in that specific program evaluation process. Learner motivation, variable entry levels of knowledge and skills. So giving the same teaching session to learners at different stages is going to result in a difference in efficacy. Giving an introductory talk to senior level learners really is not going to have the same effect as it would on an entry level learner. Relationships between important program elements. We've touched on this several times about how there can be an effect on different program elements when you introduce a new program element. The program context, we've touched on that as well. And the effectiveness of resources. So Kirkpatrick's evaluation model really doesn't look at whether the resources put into the teaching session were good or not. You can build it into sort of reaction, perhaps, but you're not really looking at was a good use of technology and other resources. And then assumption of causality. Again, in this model, it assumes that the change you've made is going to have a direct impact on the outcome that you desire. And again, as we all know, an association doesn't always mean causality. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, so I think I'm taking quite a bit of time. I'm going to quickly go through the logic model, the definition of what logic model means, and then again, another example of how logic model can be used in a program evaluation context. So logic model is really, it's a fairly popular model because it makes logical sense. So people like to use it. It can be linear or it can be cyclical too. And I'll show you how that can work. It assumes that the relationship between the program's educational methods and the desired outcomes are clearly understood. But it is best when the educator understands that the program is dynamic, as we've talked about. And when you're applying the logic model to your program, it's nice to document both your intended outcomes as well as the unintended outcomes so that you can see what the unanticipated effects of your implementation are. So there are 4 main components to the logic model in the context of program evaluation. You have your inputs, your activities, your outputs, and your outcomes. So the inputs really speak to your resources that are required to implement your change, your educational plan. Apologize if you can hear fire alarms going off in my house, but there are other adults home that can work with that. So some of the inputs when you're looking at putting in a change into your educational design would include what sort of funding, the facilities, faculty, and technology. Those are just examples of the resources you need to implement your change. Activities really go hand in hand with outputs. This is your actual change that you want to implement. So it can be the treatment for your educational design program. So strategies, innovations that you want to do, and that can be either a novel teaching method or introduction of a new rotation into your educational program. That's the activity. Now, every activity needs to go hand in hand with the output. So the activity has to be measured, and that's your output. So if you're implementing a new talk, you have to the output you may measure maybe attendance at this talk. And that says something about the activity. It doesn't have to be attendance, but that's just an example. Faculty recruitment, if you're developing a number of modules for teaching, the number of modules that are developed, that can be an output measurement. And that's to differentiate from outcomes, which is something that you want to measure more in a long-term way. Outcomes can be short-term, medium-term, or long-term. But it's different from the output. It's that it's not a direct measurement of the activity. It's more a measurement of the implemented activities on your program. So some examples would include satisfaction with the new education curriculum, exam scores, or if you're looking at a broader long-term outcome, patient care. So some overlap with Kirkpatrick's model there. And just to take you through an example of how to use the logic model, I have another vignette. You're taking over for the program director of a small neuroradiology residency program, and the program just underwent accreditation. The program has received an AFI, so that stands for Area for Improvement, with respect to the Royal College Standards of Accreditation. So for those who are not familiar with the Royal College Standards of Accreditations, the standards are divided into domains, which are measured by different elements and indicators. And then, if one of the indicators is not quite up to par, then you receive an AFI for that, an area for improvement. So in this case, the element 3.4, there is an effective organized system of resident assessment has received an AFI. In other words, there really is no effective organized system for resident assessment. So how can I use the logic model to evaluate my system of assessment and come up with new ideas to improve the system of assessment? So I am going to use the logic model, and I'm actually going to work backwards, very similar to Kirkpatrick's model. So I'm going to start with my problem. What is my overarching area of concern? So my overarching concern is that there is a poor system of assessment in place. Accreditation body has told me I need a better way to assess my learners, assess how they're doing. So I'm going to start with outcomes. I'm going to come up with a few outcomes. They can be short, medium, and long term. So a short-term outcome would be learner satisfaction with the system of assessment. Do the learners like how they're being assessed? Medium term could be more exam scores. If I improve my system of assessment, will that translate to an improvement in exam scores? And a long-term outcome would be patient care. So if I improve how residents are assessed, if they're getting better quality feedback, will that result in improved patient care in the long run? So I'm going to choose one of these outcomes to look at, and then I'm going to use the logic model to sort of work backwards to see how I can undergo program evaluation and implement change to my program. So learner satisfaction with the assessment. Again, I'm going to do activities and outputs together because they kind of go hand in hand. So I'm going to look at the assessment tools that I have. Let's say I want to implement a workplace-based assessment. I've done some reading and I know that workplace-based assessments are very helpful for residents or for learners in any program. Now I'm going to measure whether the learners are happy with this assessment tool. I'm going to measure the utility, essentially number of workplace-based assessments being performed. Are the learners actually using this assessment tool? So that's an output for this implemented activity. Now, let's say I want to implement annual face-to-face meetings between the program director and the learner. So specific meetings to address assessment. We go over the assessment tools, the feedback that the resident has gotten annually, and then I'm going to implement a measurement of how much they are satisfied with this meeting. So I'm going to maybe put in an exit survey for graduating residents. And one of the questions on that exit survey is going to say, did you find it useful to have annual meetings with the program director? And then I'm going to implement another activity for learner satisfaction with assessment. I'm going to increase the frequency of in-training examinations. So let's say, I wasn't doing enough mock examinations as part of my assessment program. I'm going to increase the frequency of this. And then I'm going to tie in a measurement, a feedback form for after each examination. And on that feedback form, I'm going to say, was this a useful mock examination? Did you find it helpful? So altogether, this is going to have an impact on my outcome. And then, of course, going backwards, the last thing you're going to look at is really going to be your inputs. And that's going to be your resources to fund your activities. So I'm going to develop a working group to develop my system of assessment. I'm going to do faculty development to ensure my faculty know how to give assessments, quality feedback. And then I have to look at funding or facilities if I'm going to put in training examinations, especially in my specialty in radiology. You need computers, a lot of computers. So you can see how you can use logic model to work backwards to evaluate something that may be a gap or a deficiency in your program. And then after you have this model all mapped out, then you sort of start from the beginning and you work towards the end. So that's the logic model, very logical way to do things. There are some limitations. There's the inherent linearity that results in working in this model, but you can make it cyclical. So you can take learner satisfaction as your outcome, and then you can use the answers from your measurement instruments, and then redesign your system of assessment over and over again. So that's that continuous quality improvement cycle in program evaluation. But the linearity does result in some unanticipated outcomes. That's why it is important to have room to record unintended outcomes. So if we go back to the example, implementing workplace-based assessments, it may improve learner satisfaction with the system of assessment, but it may also produce, it may demonstrate that the faculty really don't know how to give quality feedback. That may be an unintended outcome. And once you have that, then you can actually go back and reevaluate your education design even more. So this type of revision is often necessary in logic models, but it is really good for initial planning and development for an education program. Okay, I will now hand over to Rebecca to talk a little bit about a different model for professional development.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Taylor, and I'm an educational developer at the McPherson Institute. I'm going to be talking to you today about a model for evaluating professional development programming using a model by Guskey. And just now in the chat, I've provided a link to an article that informs a lot of what I'll be sharing. So feel free to open that up and take a look should you wish to, now or after today's session. So if you were able to attend our session a couple of weeks ago at the MacPFD conference, you will have seen this slide before, which provides an overview of the Gusky model for evaluating professional development workshops, models, different types of supports. And you might notice that it is reflective or fairly similar to the Kirkpatrick model. There are a few differences. One is that we've kind of flipped the pyramid. So we're starting at the most basic or sort of easy to measure level of participants' reactions to some sort of professional development. And then it gets more sort of complicated as you go further down the list to number 5. And another major difference between the Gusky model and the Kirkpatrick model is that here with the Gusky model, we have an additional level, which is number 3, which is asking you to measure organization change and support, which are things like advocacy, support, accommodation, facilitation, or recognition of your professional development support at your workplace or at your institution. And this one can be maybe a little more challenging or less straightforward of how to measure, which we'll get to. So this is sort of a basic outline of the Gusky model. And what I'm going to do now is go through an example of how we use the Gusky model at the McPherson Institute to inform the design of a professional development program, I'll say, a few years ago. So I'll take you through that example now. So what we ended up with was something called the Educator Enhancement Program. That's what we're evaluating using the Gusky model. And I'll show you in the next couple of slides what that program looks like, what it is. But first, what I want to do is take you through the process of how we designed it and how evaluation sort of came into play in the design of our professional development program. Where we started was by doing a survey of faculty needs back in 2017. And that survey was sent out not really even just through the McPherson Institute, but it was more of an institutional initiative. There were a few other offices or service units, like the provost office, I believe, that were part of this same survey. And so we each had our own little section asking questions about faculty preferences. And ours were to do with what kinds of teaching and learning support do you want? Do you want professional development designed about for you? What sort of timelines would be preferable to you? How long a session? What time of day? These kinds of things. So both information on content preferences and timing practical preferences, which would inform whether a person would attend our sessions. So we got that information, and then we started to sketch out an initial draft of the program, which again, I'll show you in a moment. And when we were designing our program, we took a few different things into consideration. So first, we wanted to look at what the participants wanted, which was what that survey was really helpful to determine, like the types of content, the format of how we offered the session in person or online, timing preferences, as I mentioned. But then we, as the deliverers of this program, also had our own needs to keep in mind. Like, we know we have our own experiences of what will encourage people to come, what will be attractive to people to come to our types of programming, and how to retain people so that they stick with the session. And so those kinds of lessons learned, we also brought into the initial design because we have that expertise too that could be useful to it. And so we started to sketch something out, and then that's when we picked the Gusky framework as one that could inform our program design, as well as how we would evaluate its success further down the road. And so I'll show you in a few slides sort of how we aligned our program design to the Gusky model to inform the ways that we evaluated throughout our program. And selecting the Gusky model allowed us to do things to make different refinements to our program design before it was finalized. So it helped us figure out what kind of level of learning we were hoping to achieve with our participants. So not just sort of rote memorization of information that we would sort of share with the participants, but application and synthesis, things like that. It also helped us figure out what kinds of assessment methods we wanted to use through our program. And then, sort of in a practical sense, it also helped us ask and answer who is going to do this evaluation of this program. Who at the McPherson Institute is responsible for it, which is an important practical consideration to keep in mind. And then towards the end of 2017, we did our soft launch with our first couple of sessions that were part of the Educator Enhancement Program. So that's the process. And one thing that I think is notable here is that we chose an evaluation framework kind of midway. But with the work that you're doing, you might already sort of be inclined to gravitate towards a particular evaluation framework. And I wouldn't discourage you from picking it right from the beginning of your process of designing. If you have that in hand, you might not need to have an iterative method of coming up with your program design. So yeah, if you have it selected earlier, that's great. But that process, it led us to this program called the Educator Enhancement Program, as I mentioned. And the way it's formatted is to have 3 separate sessions that each serve a different purpose. So in our faculty development program, educators would be invited to sign up for different seminars on different topics like teaching online, scholarship of teaching and learning, active learning. Those were the different topics. And the first session that they would come to would be focused on content and resources. So a lot of facilitator talking out, telling you about the topic of the session, giving you resources, things like that. Then the participants would go away, come back for session 2, and that would be a chance for them to apply it and get some peer feedback or facilitator feedback on what they'd learned. So now we're sort of climbing the levels of learning to having, so that the facilitators have a chance to see whether the participants sort of took that information on board and have started to incorporate it into their practice. Then again, the participants would go away and come back, and a little while later, to sort of wrap up the entire session, we would have a reflection and synthesis session. And so there we would talk about, like, how did it go? How did applying active learning work in your classroom? What are your lessons learned? And what might you do differently next time you try it out? And so that encouraged the participants to reflect on what had happened and to get to that higher level of synthesis of their learning through this model. And to cap it all off with each seminar, with each 3-part seminar, at the end, we would ask our participants to write a short written narrative outlining what they learned and how they're going to apply it and that sort of thing. So the program wasn't just sort of a series of single seminars. You could sort of pick and choose different seminars to build yourself a certificate of completion. So that's what the Educator Enhancement Program really was. It was 2 different certificates of completion that you could work towards. And so with the foundational program, you would take 5 different seminars of those 3 parts that I was describing. And then you'd need to do a reflective portfolio, which was pulling together the different reflections you'd written after each of your 5 seminars. And then you could work towards the advanced program, which would ask you to complete 3 additional seminars, plus one of our longer practicums that we offer through the McPherson Institute, like a multi-day instructional skills workshop or our multi-day course redesign seminar. And then again, adding to your reflective portfolio to bolster it with your additional learning. And so that was the structure of our entire program. It really started with individual seminars that we broke into sessions, and then we built it up to this entire certificate of completion program. And this is how that design aligns with the Gusky model. So with level 1, participants' reactions, at the end of every session 1, so the session that focused on content resources, we would offer a survey to see participant satisfaction, what they learned from it, what they thought about the session, to get that immediate feedback on how that session was for them. And then the fact that we had sort of 3 separate sessions make up a seminar made it very easy to do post-testing or knowledge checking throughout the seminar experience. So that really helped us get data towards level 2 participants' learning before the seminar was even over. And also at the end of each seminar, when participants would write a reflection, that's when we would get additional information on what their key takeaways were, let's say, from each seminar as a whole. Now, level 3, organization, support, and change, was the one that was sort of trickiest, that we found hardest to incorporate into our program design. And looking back, I would say that if we were asked to pull together data to align with level 3, I think we could do it, because things like the faculty needs survey that started this whole process off, we did that in alignment with like the provost office and other high-level offices at McMaster, which provides a bit of evidence that the university was on board with what we were planning or starting to plan. And then we could do things like take strategy documents or emails or testimonials from high-level administrators that support or recommend our educator enhancement program, and that would be evidence. So we could pull it together, but we didn't really plan ahead for it or figure out exactly where we would go for these sources of data at level 3, if I were being honest about how we did the planning. With level 4, participants' use of new knowledge and skills, that we sort of gleaned from, again, the participants' reflections in their portfolio, sort of at the certificate of completion level when they've done 5 seminars, or as part of writing that portfolio to cap off their certificate of completion, there was usually a one-on-one consultation to talk about what they might want to put in their portfolio. And so from that, I sort of bolded the interviews with participants, because I figured that was one way to check in with participant. And then finally, level 5, student learning outcomes, the portfolios that they made to cap off their certificate of completion experience was the best way for us to get information on what impact it had on the students. And so one limitation there is that we're asking the instructor to tell us what students learned, not asking students what students learned, which might be a more accurate way or valid way of getting that level 5 data. We just went straight with the instructor or the participant who had taken our sessions to get data at each of the levels that we were measuring, for simplicity's sake. So that's how our program was informed and aligned with the Gusky model.